Why did the Germans start using captured Soviet submachine guns despite already having one of the nicest ones of their own? Why did they also almost completely stop producing it at one point in the war? And what replaced it? Well, to make any sense of it, we need to go back to the very beginning of submachine guns, and who actually came up with them. In the beginning of the 20th century, all armies still used those long bolt-action rifles, because power, precision, and range were seen as the most important features of a rifle. But then came the world's first machine guns and quick-firing artillery, and so the open, mobile style of fighting with infantry and cavalry charges quickly broke down into the deadlock of trenches in the First World War. The way of fighting the war quickly turned into small raiding parties that would crawl over no man's land at night and infiltrate enemy trenches, where the 1-meter-long 5-shot rifles, accurate up to 1,000 meters, couldn't really work in savage close-quarters fighting in those tight spaces. Neither could the 100-pound Maxim water-cooled machine gun. There were pistols and revolvers, but they held just a few rounds, so there was little firepower coming out of them to reliably clear the trench. So while Americans used their infamous trench shotgun, the Germans were among the first to come up with reliable submachine guns, or, as they called them, machine pistols, to arm their elite stormtroopers. At first, they tried to convert existing pistols to full auto, or use that so-called artillery Luger, which was a version of the Luger pistol with a buttstock, a longer barrel, and that snail drum 32-round magazine, originally intended for artillery crews so they wouldn't need to carry heavier rifles. But they wanted the real weapon for the trenches, so the firm of Theodor Bergmann and designer Hugo Schmeisser developed the world's first practical submachine gun, the Maschinenpistole 18, or MP18 for short. It took that 32-round snail magazine from the artillery Luger since it was chambered in the same 9mm caliber. It fired between 350 and 500 rounds per minute, which for the time was pretty much the best thing to fight with in the trenches. It first saw action in the German Spring Offensive of 1918, where special stormtrooper units broke the stalemate of trench warfare for the first time. They shocked the Allied soldiers in close-quarters combat, spraying the trenches with automatic fire. Though the offensive eventually failed and only under 30,000 MP-18s were produced, they made quite a dramatic impression in the final months of the war, and opened the eyes of other nations to what small pistol-caliber, fast-firing weapons could do. So nearly every submachine gun created from that point on until the end of World War II had some element borrowed from Schmeisser's design. After the war, Schmeisser improved the design and came up with the MP28, which had a simpler straight-box magazine instead of the drum, and the gun was sold mostly for foreign and police use. But a few years later, the Germans were preparing for round 2 in global wars, so despite the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, among other weapons they were developing, they wanted something better suited for vehicle crews or paratroopers than the full-size rifle. Then the Spanish Civil War happened, where Germans saw how effective submachine guns could be in close-quarters street fighting, so they issued a requirement in 1938 for a new machine pistol. The designer Heinrich Vollmer answered with the MP38, which was specifically created for the Wehrmacht. And unlike the earlier wooden stock design, this one was quite futuristic, actually the first submachine gun with no wood at all, and the first ever to have a folding stock. The receiver was made of machined steel, while the foregrip and pistol grip were made of Bakelite, which was an early form of plastic. But although the gun looked fancy, this created a problem after sustained firing, because these materials spread heat much more than wood. This is why you'd usually see German soldiers with submachine guns wearing gloves, as they quickly learned how hot the gun would be after firing a couple magazines. Later also came the MP41 with a wooden stock, but it was a really rare version. The charging handle was on the left side, with the idea that the soldier could still hold his hand on the trigger while reloading or clearing a jam. It operated on a simple open-bolt blowback design, chambered in the well-known German 9mm cartridge, of course, and firing at some 500 rounds per minute. Basically, it was the same MP18 concept, but now modernized for the new war. It was immediately adopted by the German army that same year, but only a handful of MP38s would actually see service in World War II. When the Germans invaded Poland, only about 8,000 of them were in service across the entire army because production lagged behind. But they proved quite useful in the new form of blitzkrieg tactics, so Germans now wanted the version that could really be mass-produced, meaning a cheaper, simpler, but still effective design. And this led to the legendary MP40. The core of the weapon remained basically the same, just optimized for speed of production. Expensive milled parts were replaced with stamped sheet metal pressings and spot welds wherever possible. This significantly eased the production, but it didn't come without flaws. Early versions were of lower quality and prone to jamming, but newer models corrected most of those flaws quickly. One important quirk from the MP38 that was corrected in the MP40 was its tendency to fire by accident, because it didn't have a proper safety. Jolting or dropping the weapon could discharge it, which wasn't really the safest thing in the world, so the MP40 solved this with a dual-slot safety notch. It's basically a bolt handle that could be pushed into a locked position with the bolt either closed or open. However, all in all, the MP40 was mechanically pretty much the same as its older brother, sharing the same double-stack 32-round box magazines. By the way, the magazine was patented by Hugo Schmeiser, and although he didn't have a direct role in developing the MP38 and MP40, the submachine guns got the nickname Schmeiser because his name was stamped on the magazines. Anyway, Germans were now spitting out as many MP40s as they could, and they managed to lower the production cost to 57 Reichsmarks per unit, which is about $1,200 today, so it still wasn't really cheap. But they eventually made over 1 million MP40s, making it the most produced German automatic weapon of the war. Now, the cost of the MP40 was roughly half the cost of the American Thompson, so Americans later introduced their M3, the so-called grease gun, which lowered the cost to a fraction of the Thompson by borrowing and applying some of the MP40 production features. The British did the same thing with their Sten that could be produced even for as little as half of the cost of the grease gun, coming in a similar price range to the Soviet PPSH. We'll compare these guys a bit more when you see what they did on the battlefield and why the MP40 became so hated. The MP40 was intended to be more sort of a specialist weapon, so the ordinary soldiers would rarely have one, especially early in the war. It was reserved for NCOs, commandos, assault groups, and tank crews. You see, the German infantry squad was built around the machine gun, either the MG-34 or 42. The machine gun was served by a 3-man crew of a gunner, his assistant, and an ammo carrier, and they were the squad's main source of firepower. Another 6 soldiers carried Kar-98 rifles and protected the team, while only the NCO leading the squad had the MP40, to show off his status. He carried 6 magazines in special pouches, along with a loaded tool and a pistol as a sidearm. Paratroopers were actually among the first to adopt MP40s given their complicated way of getting into combat by jumping from a plane, and panzer crews followed for their cramped interior where the full-size rifle would often get stuck. And by the way, you see this little weird thing under the barrel? It's actually made so the vehicle crews could rest the barrel on the side of the armor, and that little hook would keep the gun in place while firing. Just one of many examples of how far ahead the Germans were thinking. Now, as for only some of the troops having the MP40, well, this would change quite a lot once the Germans started fighting the Soviet Red Army on the Eastern Front in the rubble of cities, in places like the infamous Stalingrad. Here in the bombed-out ruins of the city, where fighting was at very close range, like in World War I trenches, submachine guns became extremely important again. However, what wasn't really good news for the Germans was the fact that the Soviets had produced 6 times more submachine guns than they did. The Soviets had squads armed only with PPSH submachine guns that, although pretty simply built, turned out to work much better in those conditions than the fancier German MP40. So it wasn't long before the Germans began using any Soviet PPSH they could lay their hands on, and the command actually tried to ban this, but the officers then looked at the Soviet weapons and pretty much said, well, that's not so bad. So they actually copied the whole design and rechambered captured submachine guns to fire 9mm instead of 7.62 Tokarev. They made an adapter so the captured guns could work with the MP40 magazines, and some 10,000 of them were converted this way. Even more interestingly, the Soviet PPSH could work with the German 7.63 Mauser cartridge, which was their older pistol caliber. They had plenty of this ammo sitting in depots anyway, so they could supply the captured submachine guns even without converting them to 9mm. This is why the PPSH became the second most common submachine gun in German service, and ironically mostly used against the very country that produced it. So let's briefly compare these two. The PPSH-41, chambered in 7.62 Tokarev, was firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute, and the cartridge itself was smaller but much faster with better penetration and effective range than the slower-moving 9mm, although the 9mm had better stopping power. However, the rate of fire and the PPSH's ability to work in any conditions because of a simpler design were what won the day. In such a form of combat, you could suddenly enter a room full of enemies, and the PPSH could empty its magazine in under 2 seconds, which would most of the time take care of your problem in urban fighting. The MP40 couldn't do that with its rate of fire being more than 2 times lower, but it was more controllable for longer bursts. You could basically hold it on the target and empty the whole magazine into a tight group. Also, it conserved the ammo better. The MP40 weighs about 4 kilos unloaded, which is quite heavy for a submachine gun. The folding stock tends to start wobbling after some time in the field, but you aren't going to use it for accurate sniper shots from the shoulder anyway. Germans even designed the version which held 2 magazines side by side to shorten the loading time, most likely because they got an inferiority complex from the Soviet 71-round drum magazines. But only a few hundred were built as they weren't really practical. Soldiers in the field achieved the same effect by simply tying 2 magazines together for quicker reloads. As for the biggest weakness of the MP40, it was its magazine and feed system. You see, the magazine was a double-column, single-feed design. This means that rounds are stored one beside another, and the magazine then narrows to one stack at the very end, so only one round is going to be loaded in the chamber at a time. The American Thompson, for example, used a double-column, double-feed design where rounds were stored not directly beside one another, but slightly asymmetrically. And this was a much more reliable solution, because in the MP40's case, the magazines were made from thin steel, and in the dirty conditions of the battlefield, it was easy for them to misfeed and jam the gun. German soldiers learned to oil and keep their magazines clean if they wanted them to work during the battle. The MP40 shouldn't be held by the magazine, but by the small purpose-built grip, because you could slightly bend the magazine, which would then jam the rounds inside. And soldiers preferred to load no more than 28 rounds instead of the full 32, so the spring wouldn't be compressed all the way back, and there would be less risk of malfunctions. Also, because of this design, MP40 magazines were difficult to load, so Germans issued a magazine loading tool with each MP40 kit, so the soldier wouldn't bruise his thumbs after loading 6 magazines. But the gun itself performed quite reliably, even in heavy conditions like the African desert and Eastern Front, due to its simple direct blowback action, although the magazines caused quite a few headaches throughout the war. Allied troops generally avoided using the MP40 in combat, and it was actually strictly forbidden to do so in a few instances. And that's because of friendly fire. The MP40 had a really distinctive sound when firing, and when Allied soldiers used captured MP40s, that sound created additional confusion on the battlefield, which led to blue-on-blue incidents. The soldiers quickly learned the dangers that come with using enemy weapons, so they avoided that if they didn't really have to. Now, while Germans still centered their main infantry weapon around full-power rifles, they also realized the advantages of higher capacity and faster-firing weapons like submachine guns. But the problem for submachine guns was short range and not great stopping power, and that's why Germans went looking for a cartridge that would be something in between the pistol and full-power rifle round. That exact sweet spot to be effective inside the range where the majority of fighting took place. For World War II, this range was under 300 meters, so Germans first came up with a new cartridge by shortening the standard 7.92 by 57mm Mauser to 7.92 by 33mm Kurz, meaning short. Then, through trial and error, they eventually designed the world's first assault rifle around this cartridge, the Sturmgewehr 44. It had a 30-round magazine, full auto for close quarters, and was also effective out to 400 meters in semi-auto. And it beautifully bridged that gap in firepower all sides were struggling with at the time. In 1944, the Sturmgewehr replaced the MP40 in both production focus and doctrine. However, the war ended before Germans could perfect the concept of the universal assault rifle, although they still produced over 400,000 STGs. The Sturmgewehr couldn't turn the tide of the war, but it showed the world yet another concept that would inspire many more generations of weapons to come.